It's a real thrill and honour to be giving this keynote to launch the Innovation Summit. I'm just delighted. I'm delighted that the agenda is shifting. We've been in identity for a long time. We have struggled with identity. It's a complicated field. And at the same time, as cyberspace has evolved, and as the analog and the digital blending through the work of GS1, we find ourselves dealing with some enormous problems around integrity, truth, reliability, provenance. And I'm seeing a shift, and I'm urging a reframing of identity so that we can take the progress that we have made in identity and apply it to a much bigger purpose. The tools that we've got to safeguard identity can do so much more. And I want to just scratch the surface today and set the scene for this summit by urging that the technologies that we use for identity can start to be applied to build huge scale, international scale infrastructure for the digital economy. A little bit of a history lesson. The standard treatment of identity comes to us through the experience of national identity cards becoming digitized and becoming modernized for the internet age. But a lot of this stuff is rooted in ID card proposals. Australia had an infamous proposal in the 1980s. The United Kingdom tried an identity card under the Blair government in the mid-noughties. Famously, the United Kingdom, the United States, Australia, Canada, much of the English-speaking world is allergic to national identity for good reasons, and we're not going to talk about that too much, except to observe that it's very, very difficult in these countries now to talk about digital identity at any scale without getting mired in the bogeyman of national ID and government surveillance. So with that backdrop, we have tried to digitize, and we've had some very well-meaning, very well-funded public-private partnerships that have tried to take the standard model of identity and to scale it up and to produce seed funding with the hope that we would see a sustainable market of identity services, identity providers providing in different ways, commercial and otherwise, identities that people would then presumably use online to go about their business, both personal and mercantile. NSTIC, the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace, quite a mouthful. In the United States, very well funded, $40 or $50 million, at least 15 different pilot projects through 2009 to 2016. In parallel, the United Kingdom tried to empanel a number of government-approved identity providers and identity services, banks, post offices, some government agencies, over about the same time frame, with a fairly difficult experience that identity providers have yet to find a sustainable business model. In parallel, we have had some tremendous technology progress based on what are called trust frameworks. Canada is working hard on the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework. Australia, likewise, on the Trusted Digital Identity Framework. And in Australia, we also have a banking sector, a private sector trust framework called Trust ID. And these frameworks have all been seeded and inspired by a standard model that tells us that we'll be subjects that need an identity, relying parties that will consume an identity, and in the middle, there'll be an identity provider that makes it all happen. The bad news is that this model remains hypothetical. With some exceptions in some regulated environments, we haven't seen this come to pass. We haven't seen commercially sustainable, successful identity providers. The business model is somehow broken, and we have not yet reckoned really with what's going on with the fundamentals of what we call digital identity. At one level, digital identity is really, really simple. I mean, we want to know who we're dealing with online. We have the technical task of authentication. How do you know that it's Steve Wilson? We've got usernames and passwords. Famously, we've all got too many usernames and passwords. We've got one-time password technology. We've got biometrics. We've got a number of technical protocols that are all working really well. And know it or not, or feel it or not, your experience of the internet today under covers is determined by protocols like OAuth and OpenID Connect. So this is all good stuff. And it's now being modernized by the W3C consortium and by GS1 developing protocols and standards for handling these authentication signals. But they're just signals. They're just data. Digital identity can't be anything other than data. I am coming to you over digital media. It's all ones and zeros. We have tried to personify identity. We have almost tried to anthropomorphize it. I think that we romanticize identifiers. In real life, you might think that there's more to identity than ones and zeros, but you know, your experience of me in real life, I'm coming to you through Teams or Zoom, it's all still data. What else can it be? I think it's really important that we start to apply some engineering discipline to this. I don't for a second deny the humanity and the personhood and the tremendous problems that we've got, the challenges in cyberspace of dealing with dignity and personhood. I don't deny that for a second. But to try and solve this through digital identity, I think is a famous misstep. So what's big today? It's not all doom and gloom. There are some fantastic tools that have been becoming available now for 5 or 10 years. The shift has been from personal identity to objective attributes and claims. And again, that starts to sound a little bit pedantic and a little bit like we're trying to philosophize here. But the important thing is that if you remember how you live your life in the real world, you'll take a prescription to a pharmacist. The pharmacist doesn't really know who you are. You don't know who the pharmacist is, but you know enough for that transaction to happen. The pharmacist doesn't even know who the doctor is, but the pharmacist can rely on the credentials of the doctor. So it's not who the doctor is or who the pharmacist is, it's what they are in context. Attributes, verifiable credentials. Under the covers, it's all about private keys and wallets, and people's digital sophistication about how much do you need to know about this stuff is shifting all the time. We are seeing a lot of this technology being consumerized and being presented in meaningful ways. So we have the metaphors of wallets, which are masking the reality of cryptographic proofs, protocols for determining provenance and originality of data. The FIDO protocols, the DID documents, Hyperledger Aries, these are powerful programs that are all converging on this focus, reshifting from personal identity to objective attributes. And there are some other important tricks. You're going to hear a lot about this through the Innovation Summit, because binding data to actors, people and entities and organizations, the binding of the data so that you can rely upon the data is the bread and butter. It's the nuts and bolts of cyberspace. And ultimately, here's a new term. Ultimately, this is converging on verifiable information. The big task, and I keep talking about the big task in the internet, the urgent problem is to know what you're really dealing with. How do we deal with fake news? How do we deal with deep fakes? How do we deal with synthetic persona? Verifiable information I think it's going to be the catchphrase. And I hope that this catchphrase comes in and supplants all of this romantic talk about identity. So to emphasize the transition from who to what, credentials matter more than identity. 2013, a good friend of mine, Andrew Nash, said at one of the big conferences that attributes are more interesting than identity. And that, of course, includes organizations. Organizational identity, organizational attributes have been built into the GS1 data carrier standards now for a very long time. We're getting ready for the Internet of Things, aren't we? The identity of things is the catchphrase. And I think that we're going to need a richer idea than the identity of things. I think that we're going to need to be able to unpack what's going on, the history of devices, the warranty of devices and products and services. And certainly, the GS1 data carrier standards are pointing that way. At some level, this all comes down to trust. I think that trust is the most overused term in my field. You look at the number of tech companies that simply throw their name into throw trust into their company name, or use trust in their protocol names and their product names, as if it's magic. It's not. Trust is hard work, and as the old Italian proverb goes, it's good to trust, but it's actually much better not to. So what do we mean by that? The technicians these days talk about zero trust. Zero trust is the idea that you should treat everybody the same. Don't assume that an actor inside your network is going to be trustworthy just because they come in with badges or history or some sort of certain logon credential. So security people are saying, look, let's trust nobody. Let's treat everybody the same. I think the identity people need to shift and follow that track and start thinking about reliability more than trust. It's a much more specific idea. What are the sources of truth that you're trying to deal with? What are the real-time signals that you're going to use to generate reliability and to know what you're dealing with? Ultimately, it's all about better decision-making. Now, let's look at how data carriers have evolved. And I'm going to pick on credit cards and magnetic stripe and chip technology, but we're also going to remind ourselves about how barcode technology has evolved over time as well. In 1955, I think it was, a bunch of restaurants in New York City got together and thought that there was a better way of being paid than having their customers hand over cash. I guess somebody wasn't good enough for the money on the night, and they had to extend credit. So how do you organize credit? You organize it around the Diners Club card with a network business model where money doesn't flow directly from the customer to the merchant, but money flows through a network of banks. What you need is an account number and some other metadata like an expiry date. The trick is, how does the merchant get hold of that data? How's the data carried? We saw the first evolution of this data carrier story through the advent of magnetic stripes from IBM, and then of course the barcode reader at about the same time, early 70s, the first barcode reader on that famous pack of chewing gum. Physical provenance was the next question. If somebody's handing over a card or a barcode, how do you know that it's come from where you thought it come from? How do you know what the originality is of that data? Physical provenance, turn over the card, look for a hologram. Digital provenance, much more powerful, around about year 2000. Chip technology, digital signatures coming in. The original verifiable credential. Verifiable credentials these days are associated with blockchain and other digital technologies. Cast your mind back to the first EMV, chip and pin card, around about year 2000. The function of the chip and pin card is to take exactly the same data that's on the back of your magnetic stripe card, but to present it to the merchant terminal in a cryptographically verifiable way. What does cryptographic proof mean? There are digital signatures on the data that prove that the data came from a bank and it hasn't been made up by a criminal, it hasn't been stolen. The chip itself is digitally signed so that you know that the chip is genuine. And these cryptographic proofs work to verify that the credentials are reliable. The original verifiable credential, think about that. This technology has continued to evolve. Two-dimensional barcodes. In fact, there is the possibility within QR and 2D barcodes to generate digital signatures and to produce physical provenance in a dynamically generated 2D barcode. And we're seeing that technology being used more and more in the digital presentation of 2D barcodes on mobile phones. Intelligence, the secure element in a mobile phone is handling exactly the same data. It's your PAN and it's your expiry date, digitally signed by the issuing bank for provenance, but then overlaying intelligence so that it's context dependent, biometrics, consumerizing authentication, so that if I use PayWave, the limit on my payments is much, much higher than what it is on a mobile phone versus a normal smart card. Now, the future of this, I think, is autonomy. That little MCU, microcontroller at the top right, is one of the Microsoft certified Azure Sphere devices where computing is coming out to the edge. And the wallets that we keep talking about, the chips that are holding private keys, many, many private keys, device identifiers, organizational identifiers being secreted into the microcontroller units at the edge of the cloud. Let's not lose sight of what we're trying to do here. We're trying to make decisions in this blended hybrid analog digital world. We're trying to make decisions. We're trying to build a stack of decision making that reaches into the real world, and it takes us all the way up to actions that we can take on data. There's a big feedback loop, and the feedback loop generates the ability to make decisions. What do you need to know to make a decision? Where are you going to get the data from, and how are you going to know it's true? We need to shift away from vague ideas of personal identity, vague ideas of trust, and focus on those questions. What do you need to know? Where are you going to get it? How are you going to know that the data is true? So this is leading to this, I think, key conclusion that data is a utility. I'm certainly not the first person to point that out. People say in a contested, fairly controversial way that data is the new crude oil. It's an interesting debate. All metaphors have got rough edges, and there are problems with the crude oil metaphor. But you know, it's a rich metaphor, and it points to the reliability of data being the pivotal question as we go into the digital economy. So if data is a utility, if it's like clean water, or if it's like solid broadband or electricity connections, we need to turn our minds to quality. Forget about identity, it's the quality of data. What do you need to know? Where are you going to get it? And how are you going to know that that knowledge is true? So with the blend of analog and digital, I see these technologies being built into what I want to call infrastructure. It's digital infrastructure. It is treating data and information as the defining raw material of the 21st century. And we're very close now to having the tools and the data carriers and the protocols and the standards where we're going to bring analog and digital together and have real reliability, real quality data for the data economy.